The courtroom was already full before the case was even called, the air so heavy with whispers and the shifting weight of judgment that it felt like the trial had already been decided. People leaned into one another, trading small smiles and comments as if they were at a theater waiting for the play to begin. Only here the play was real and the stakes were someone's life. Danielle Carter sat at the defense table, a black woman in her 30s, dressed in a plain dark suit that did not seek to impress anyone and yet managed to set her apart. She didn't look broken and she didn't look angry either. She looked steady, centered, like a mountain rooted to the earth while everything else spun around it. But if you looked closely, if you allowed yourself to notice the details, you could see her fingers tapping softly against the table before going still, as if she had caught herself in the act of letting nerves show. To the crowd, it was nothing. To anyone paying real attention, it was proof that she carried a storm beneath her calm. Before the jurors were even seated, before a single piece of evidence was presented, judgment had already arrived in the room. It carried itself in the certainty of a small town, where gossip substitutes for fact, and where prejudice can wear a decent suit and call itself common sense. People whispered, "What did she think would happen?" and answered themselves with, "Exactly this," as if the verdict had already been printed and delivered with the morning paper. Danielle was already guilty in their eyes, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was and what others wanted to believe about her. Then the door behind the bench opened, and Judge Harold Whitman entered. He was an older man, deliberate in movement, the type who believed discipline was not an art but a prescription, measured out in teaspoons whether you wanted it or not. He didn't slam his gavel to command the room. He didn't have to. The mere sight of him was enough to draw silence from the crowd, silence born not of respect, but of conditioned obedience. His gaze traveled the courtroom, moving from the officers against the wall to the court reporter with fingers hovering over the keys, and finally settling on Danielle. He did not sneer, not exactly, but when his eyes reached her, the temperature of the room seemed to drop half a degree. You could see the rigidity in his jaw, the unyielding conviction of a man who thought the world moved in only one direction, his, and that surprises were insults. "Be seated," he said, not as an invitation but as a command. The benches creaked as the crowd obeyed. The prosecutor began fumbling with folders, pretending to organize papers he had likely already rehearsed a dozen times. The bailiff took slow, reluctant steps toward the defense table. His duty seemed clear enough, yet he looked uneasy, as if he had drawn the short straw. "Ma'am, your bag," he said, gesturing toward the black leather tote resting at Danielle's feet. Danielle's attorney responded calmly, "It's already been cleared," but the bailiff extended his hand anyway, eyes darting to the judge for reassurance. Whitman raised an eyebrow and the gallery leaned forward in collective anticipation. Small dramas feed hungry crowds, and this was one of those small moments that felt like it carried the promise of spectacle. The bailiff reached down, fingers hovering over the bag, when Danielle spoke for the first time. Her voice was not loud, not sharp, but flat and final, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "This is not for you to touch." The words themselves weren't extraordinary, but the way the room reacted was. A ripple moved through the gallery before anyone even processed why. The bailiff's hand froze in midair. The judge's head snapped up. Even the prosecutor paused mid-motion with a paperclip in hand. Danielle still hadn't moved. She had simply spoken, and the weight of her words carried like iron. The bailiff looked to the judge for guidance, and Whitman's mouth pressed into a thin line, the expression of a man who felt tested. "Counsel," he said, directing his attention to Danielle's attorney, "control your client." Her lawyer responded steadily, "She has exercised her right, Your Honor." The bag was screened on entry. The silence stretched like a rope pulled taut, threatening to snap. Finally, Whitman flicked his fingers and the bailiff withdrew, embarrassed by the quiet he left in his wake. The room exhaled but uneasily, as if the script had skipped a line and no one knew how to continue. That was when the atmosphere shifted from routine to charged. You could feel it, like the tense quiet before the first serve of a tennis match, or the held breath before the bow draws across strings. The air was alive with waiting. The lines had been drawn, not in formal declarations, but in subtle gestures. The judge and the badge on one side, the quiet woman on the other, and a gallery willing to cheer whichever side made them feel safe in their own prejudice. The far door opened again, and Officer Mark Reynolds entered. He walked with the swagger of a man convinced the outcome was already his. His uniform looked pressed and gleaming, his posture oozing entitlement. He wore his grin not fully, but at the corner of his mouth, the restrained smirk of someone who believed he had already won. He glanced at Danielle the way a cat glances at a birdcage, curious maybe, but certain of its control. He took the stand casually, not because the moment demanded casualness, but because power allowed it. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and leaned into the microphone as the court reporter's keys began their steady clacking rhythm. A rhythm that already sounded like a verdict. The prosecutor began, "Officer Reynolds, please describe for the court the circumstances under which you discovered the funds and documents in Miss Carter's vehicle." A murmur passed through the gallery. The words funds and documents carried the weight of something both official and dirty, the kind of phrasing designed to paint guilt even before proof. People clicked their tongues, shook their heads in quiet sympathy, some for the state, some perhaps for Danielle, but most for the comfort of their own certainty. The balance of the room shifted visibly toward Reynolds. He spoke with the ease of a man who believed his badge and his voice were enough to construct reality. His story was tidy, his sentences well-measured, his pauses generous. He played to the audience, to the judge, even to the absent jury, crafting an image of order, lawfulness, and inevitability. Every so often he looked toward the bench, and every so often Vittman nodded back, the unspoken exchange of men who believed they were reading from the same script. Danielle sat still, hands flat on the table, listening without interruption. Her eyes did not flinch toward the cash or the documents when Reynolds described them, nor did they dart nervously toward the judge. Her composure was absolute, like ice covering a river whose current raged unseen. The only sign of life was her stillness, and somehow that stillness unsettled the room more than if she had protested. The prosecutor pressed further. "What crimes did this suggest to you, officer?" Reynolds listed them off briskly: bribery, fraud, obstruction of justice, counting with his fingers as though teaching a classroom of children. Each word landed with the weight of inevitability. When asked if he saw the defendant present, Reynolds pointed directly at Danielle, his finger in accusation more powerful than any word. The gallery leaned into it, and even the judge added his own quiet blow, saying, "You disgrace this court just by sitting here." The words weren't law, but they carried the weight of weather, chilling everything they touched. Danielle's silence held. She breathed slowly, her hands tightening and loosening around her wrist like someone tying and retying the same knot to keep herself grounded. No prayer, no protest, no tears. Just the cost of dignity, paid in restraint. Around her, the gallery buzzed with satisfaction, hungry for the next confirmation of what they had already decided was true. They wanted her guilt because it allowed them to believe the system worked. They wanted her downfall because it affirmed their biases. And yet beneath the surface of all that noise, another kind of balance was being drawn, the balance between sound and silence. Reynolds had the sound, the badge, the papers, the booming voice. Danielle had the silence, and it was sharper than any weapon. Her silence unsettled the people who wanted her to flinch, who needed her to crack so they could feel reassured. Instead, she held it, and by holding it, she forced them to lean closer, to wonder, to wait. It wasn't surrender. It was readiness. The court proceeded. The clerk shuffled forms. The judge cleared his throat. Outside, a siren wailed and then faded, as if the city itself refused to pause for their drama. Inside, something unspoken had already taken root. You could feel it in the creak of benches, in the breath people held too long. Something important had shifted, not in the evidence, not in the arguments, but in the invisible fault line of power. For a moment, everyone in the courtroom, judge, cop, gallery, even the unseen narrator, felt the tremor. They did not yet know it, but the script they trusted had already begun to unravel. The tension inside the courtroom deepened as the testimony wore on, not from what was said, but from what remained unspoken. Officer Reynolds spoke like a man used to being believed, his words carrying the confidence of someone who thought truth was his to manufacture. His sentences flowed smoothly, his pauses carefully measured, his demeanor polished for effect. Every so often he leaned forward into the microphone as if his authority alone could settle the matter. The judge nodded in rhythm, his jaw firm, his posture unbending. The gallery soaked it up, eager for confirmation of the guilt they had already decided upon. To them, Reynolds was the hero of this story, the man who had caught another crooked lawyer trying to cheat the system. They wanted to be reassured that their faith in order was justified, and Reynolds gave them exactly what they wanted. Danielle, however, did not rise to the bait. She sat motionless, her hands folded on the table, her chin steady, her eyes forward. Not once did she interrupt, not once did she object with her body language or voice. She simply listened. It was that stillness that carried weight. If Reynolds embodied noise, Danielle embodied silence, and silence can be more unsettling than thunder. People leaned closer without realizing why. They wanted her to crack, to flinch, to lash out, because that would have proven the story they were already telling themselves. Instead, she let Reynolds fill the room with words, and the more he spoke, the more the silence began to matter. When Reynolds described the cash and the documents, the gallery responded with smug little sounds, the satisfied click of tongues, the soft huff of a breath that says, "I knew it." The prosecutor stood, his voice rising with confidence as he asked the court to admit the evidence. The bag of cash and the folder of documents were passed with ceremony to the clerk, each motion punctuated by the crisp sound of evidence tags being secured. The judge granted the motion without hesitation, as if his muscles themselves had memorized the gesture. The balance of the courtroom seemed set, the trap appearing to snap shut, and yet Danielle remained unmoved. She didn't look at the evidence. She didn't trace it with her eyes like a cornered person would. She simply placed one hand over her wrist and sat as though she were holding herself steady against an unseen storm. The prosecutor asked if Danielle had cooperated. Reynolds smirked, chuckled softly, and said she had refused to answer direct questions, delayed access to personal effects, obstructed at every turn. The crowd chuckled with him, the sound of prejudice given permission. Then he delivered a line he had clearly rehearsed. "Some people just don't belong in court unless they're the accused." It landed like a joke, and the gallery responded as if he had just confirmed their worldview. Smiles appeared, heads shook in delight. The satisfaction of bias reinforced. Judge Whitman leaned forward ever so slightly and delivered his own blow. "You disgrace this court just by sitting here." The words weren't law, they were weather, a cold front rolling through the room. Even the narrator felt the chill, as though the words had struck ribs instead of air. Danielle's hands tightened, one over the other, as though she was tying a knot. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply compressed her breath, held it, and let it out with the dignity that comes only when dignity costs everything. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, smoothing a sleeve that had already been smoothed, steadying himself before approaching the storm. His questions were quiet, pointed, and careful. "You stated you conducted a search based on probable cause from a tip," he began. "Was that tip documented?" Reynolds answered quickly. "Yes, from a confidential source, and therefore not subject to verification." The attorney's mild nod suggested patience, as though humoring a child who had recited the alphabet out of order. He pressed further. "Chain of custody for the evidence. When did you first lay hands on the cash and documents?" Reynolds replied, "Bagged and tagged immediately." The lawyer's eyes flicked to the clerk's labels and then back to Reynolds. His tone remained soft. "And the documents, were they originals, professionally prepared?" Reynolds replied with speed, "Originals, stamped and signed." But then he hesitated, fumbling with the word redacted, and that tiny pause, that stumble, revealed a crack. He recovered quickly, explaining that names had been covered for privacy, but the silence that followed felt heavier than his words. The attorney let it linger, then simply said, "Convenient." Judge Whitman cleared his throat, cutting off the moment. and the lawyer stepped back with a polite, "No further questions." Reynolds sat deeper in his confidence, the gallery drinking it in, eager to dismiss the stumble as nothing. The prosecutor leapt to redirect, asking if there could be any innocent explanation for large sums of cash and payment schedules hidden in a vehicle. Reynolds replied firmly, "No." His voice carried the certainty of a man who believed he defined reality. The judge looked pleased, satisfied that the narrative was intact. Then came the moment the gallery had been waiting for. Judge Whitman turned to Danielle, his expression one of weary disdain. "Miss Carter, this is your moment to help yourself. Do you wish to address the court?" All eyes swung toward her. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder. The crowd wanted a crack, tears, rage, some outburst to confirm her guilt. Danielle raised her eyes to the bench and answered evenly, "No, Your Honor." A gasp escaped from somewhere behind. The refusal was flat, final, and it robbed the crowd of the theater they craved. The prosecutor's pen stilled. Reynolds smirked, and the judge's mouth tightened further. I felt it too, that tug of the crowd pulling me toward their certainty. It is easy to believe evidence when it's held high, tagged neatly, and spoken with authority. But Danielle's silence disturbed that certainty. She did none of the things guilty or desperate people do. She did not flail. She did not beg. She did not rush to speak. She simply remained still, and it made me uneasy about the story unfolding. The judge exhaled, tired of the charade, and announced that the state's exhibits were admitted. The clerk stamped the evidence with finality, the sound sharp enough to make a woman in the front row flinch. Reynolds stepped down from the stand with casual arrogance, tossing a half salute at no one in particular. The gallery murmured its approval, anger and satisfaction rippling through the benches. "Lock her up," someone hissed, as if savoring the chance to say the phrase aloud. Others muttered about time, about justice served. And yet, amid the noise, there were smaller, quieter sounds, the shifting of people unsettled by something they could not name. "Next to me," a woman whispered. "She didn't even look at the money." Her companion replied, "She doesn't have to." They did. Up at the defense table, Danielle's hands opened for the first time, palms flat against the wood, fingers spread as though showing she had nothing to hide. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering, but she shook her head almost imperceptibly. She wasn't refusing him. She was staying her course. If you had taken a photograph of the room right then, it would have captured the entire story in miniature. A judge whose patience had turned into judgment, a cop basking in his own smirk, a crowd eager to let bias do their thinking, and a woman who refused to meet noise with noise. That was the moment the trap clicked, not closed, not yet, but engaged. By the next morning, the headlines had already done their work. "Black lawyer caught in corruption scandal," the papers blared in bold letters. On the radio, callers spoke with certainty that didn't require evidence. "Another one abusing the system," someone said. "She should be ashamed," said another. The trial had not reached a verdict, but the court of public opinion had already slammed its gavel. Outside the courthouse, women folded their newspapers and said to each other, "She thought she was smarter than the law." The other replied with a laugh, "Well, she's not." Guilt was assumed. Dignity denied, the verdict carried not by law, but by rumor. Inside a cramped holding cell, Danielle sat alone. The paint peeled from the walls in strips, tempting her to pick at them in the silence. She didn't move. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers clasped loosely. She looked calm from the outside, but if you knew how to look, you could see the storm beneath her stillness. Her lawyer had visited earlier, offering appeals, reminding her the case was still young, but his voice carried the fatigue of a man who didn't believe his own assurances. When he left, the silence grew heavier. The phone rang later, the guard barking her name. Danielle lifted the receiver and heard the voice of an old colleague from her days as a public defender. For a moment, it almost comforted her until the words came. "Take the deal, Danielle. Plead guilty. They'll go lighter. Don't drag this out. No one wins against the system." She opened her mouth, but no words came. She listened as his voice buzzed like static, then hung up without answering. Her hand trembled only after she set the receiver down. Betrayal weighed heavier than the bars of her cell. She leaned back, eyes closed, wishing for a moment that it could all end. No trial, no whispers, no struggle. But in the dark behind her eyes, another voice came. Her mother's voice, steady as earth, repeating words from childhood, "Never bow to injustice." Tears glistened briefly, but she let them fall without wiping them away. She wondered if her mother would be proud of her silence or disappointed by it. This was the bottom, the place where stories usually end unless something shifts. Watching her then, alone, betrayed, buried under headlines, you might have thought it was over. But sometimes the bottom isn't the end. Sometimes it is the ground you need before you can rise. The courtroom the next morning carried a strange quiet, a silence that was heavier than the chatter of the previous day. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, the kind that settles over people when they are holding their breath, unsure of what might break. Judge Harold Whitman sat high on the bench, his expression carved from stone, trying to remind himself and everyone else that he still commanded authority. Officer Reynolds leaned back in the witness chair, still wearing the swagger of a man convinced that victory belonged to him, even though the small crack in his testimony from the day before lingered like a splinter under the skin of the room. The prosecutor shuffled through his notes with the confidence of a man rehearsing lines he had already memorized, while Danielle sat at the defense table still and watchful. She did not fidget, did not shift. Every pause, every glance from Reynolds was a thread she was tracing, and though she said nothing, you could see in the tilt of her head and the calm of her eyes that she was listening for something beneath the noise. The prosecutor asked Reynolds to walk the court through his timeline again. His voice carried its usual trained clarity as he recited, "At approximately 9:15, I was at the storage lot confirming the tip we received. By 9:20, I initiated a stop on Miss Carter's vehicle. I questioned her briefly, then proceeded with a lawful search. At 9:30, the cash and documents were secured." The words sounded smooth, the rhythm practiced, as if he were strolling down a familiar road. But Danielle leaned forward ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing. Something in that neat little package of times and events didn't fit. She let the silence breathe for a moment before she rose from her seat. Every head in the room turned to her, the surprise palpable. Danielle did not raise her voice. She did not bristle with anger. Instead, she spoke with calm precision, each word deliberate, dropping like stones into a still pond. "Officer Reynolds," she asked, "are you telling this court that you were at the storage lot at 9:15 and then pulled me over at 9:20? Reynolds blinked, momentarily caught off guard, then recovered quickly. "Yes, that's what I said." Danielle tilted her head just slightly, her voice steady. "So you were at two places at the same time?" A ripple ran through the gallery, whispers erupting like sparks. People frowned, calculating the distance in their heads, realizing it didn't add up. For the first time, Reynolds's composure slipped. His eyes darted to his notes, then to the prosecutor. I was moving quickly between the sites. "That's what I meant," he stammered. The explanation sounded thin, like paper tearing under strain. The judge's gavel slammed sharply. "Order!" Whitman barked, his glare fixed on Danielle. "Miss Carter, this court will not indulge in word games. Stick to proper procedure." Word games, that was what he called it. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and you could see it sprouting in the faces around the room. Reynolds tried to reclaim his rhythm, clearing his throat. "It was a misstatement," he said quickly. "First the lot, then the vehicle." "That's the order." He leaned forward again, trying to wear confidence like armor, but the stumble lingered in memory. Danielle sat back down slowly, her face unreadable. She didn't push further. She didn't need to. The question had already done its work. The gallery buzzed with unease. A woman in the front row whispered, "That doesn't make sense." A man 2 benches back shook his head. Certainty wobbled. The prosecutor jumped in, patching the hole with, "Officer, based on your training, would you agree it's possible for times to overlap when reports are written after the fact?" Reynolds seized on it instantly. "Exactly. A clerical overlap. What matters is the evidence." Judge Whitman nodded too quickly, eager to seal the crack. "Very well. Let's proceed." But the air had shifted. Everyone knew it. Danielle's hands rested flat on the table, steady as stone, but her eyes glimmered with a spark that hadn't been there before. What struck me most wasn't the contradiction itself, but the way she delivered it. No shouting, no anger, just a calm question that landed harder than any outburst. Because it was calm, it was undeniable. That was the second wave in the trial. The first had been humiliation, when Reynolds paraded his bag of cash before the court. This one was different. This one was the sound of armor cracking, the reminder that arrogance can stumble on its own shoelaces. The gavel came down again, but it couldn't erase what everyone had witnessed. Reynolds, the man who strutted into the courtroom as though it belonged to him, now looked uncertain, if only for a flicker. And that flicker was enough. Enough to make the prosecutor sweat, enough to make the gallery whisper, enough to remind everyone that truth doesn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a question, simple and sharp, leaving silence in its wake. Danielle rose again, no hesitation this time. Her voice cut clean. "Truth doesn't rush," she said evenly. "Lies always stumble first." The words landed like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward. The silence that followed was absolute. Papers stopped shuffling. Even the clock seemed to hesitate. Every eye was fixed on her. It wasn't the kind of line you forget. Reynolds shifted, his jaw tight, his skin flushing red beneath the lights. His composure faltered, replaced with something raw. His hand clenched the railing of the witness stand, and then he snapped. "Women like you don't belong here," he barked, his voice cracking across the courtroom like a whip. Gasps broke out in the gallery. People muttered in shock. One woman shook her head, disgust etched on her face. The whispers rose like fire catching in dry grass. Reynolds realized too late what he had said, but the words were already out, stripped of uniform, stripped of polish. The mask was gone, revealing something uglier beneath. The judge slammed his gavel again, shouting for order, but even he looked unsettled. For the first time, there was a flicker in Whitman's eyes, a glimpse of doubt, a glimpse of recognition that perhaps the ground was shifting under him. Danielle did not rise to meet Reynolds's insult. She didn't need to. Her silence in that moment was louder than any retort. Her composure made his anger look small, petty, and dangerous. The crowd shifted, some outraged, some satisfied, but all of them saw the truth. Reynolds wasn't protecting justice. He was protecting his pride. That was the third wave. A crack turned into a fracture. Then the bailiff called a name and the room shifted again. Angela Moore. She was not a lawyer, not an official, just an ordinary black woman in her 50s, clutching her purse as though it were armor. Her hands trembled, but her chin was lifted, her eyes steady. Fear and courage wrestled inside her, but still she moved forward. Years ago, she had been here too, but as a victim, nearly losing her home in a civil dispute where the odds were stacked against her. Everyone told her not to fight, everyone except Danielle, who had stood by her and delivered justice when no one else would. That memory carried Angela to the stand now, when the roles were reversed. She placed her hand on the Bible, voice trembling as she swore the oath, then sat gripping the rail in front of her. The defense attorney asked gently if she had something to present. Angela nodded, fumbling in her purse before handing over a small drive. "I brought a recording," she said, voice breaking on the first word before she steadied herself. "It shows Officer Reynolds near the car before he claimed to search it." The clerk loaded the video. The screen flickered with grainy black and white footage. There was Reynolds, circling Danielle's car minutes before his supposed discovery. The gallery erupted with whispers, pointing, muttering. The video wasn't conclusive, it didn't show him planting evidence, but it showed enough to raise suspicion. Reynolds jumped to his feet, his voice cracking. "This is a setup! She staged this whole thing!" He jabbed his finger toward Danielle, fury dripping from every word. His composure was gone. The judge's gavel slammed again. "Officer Reynolds, sit down!" But his authority wavered, uncertain now. Angela clung to the stand, tears streaking her cheeks, but her voice rang clear. "I'm not strong," she said, "but truth is." The words landed like a bell in a quiet church, resonant and unforgettable. The gallery hushed. People nodded, some whispering agreement, some wiping tears. Angela's courage filled the room more than any lawyer's argument had. That was the fourth wave. It did not come from evidence or clever cross-examination. It came from the courage of an ordinary woman who refused to back down, reminding everyone that truth doesn't need strength to stand. It only needs someone willing to speak it. Then it happened, sudden and unplanned. Danielle reached for her folder, and something slipped, skittering across the table and onto the floor. A badge. Not a trinket, not something from a toy store, but a real badge, its golden blue seal unmistakable. CIA. The room froze. Reynolds went pale, his confidence draining away. Judge Whitman leaned forward, squinting to confirm what he already knew he was seeing. The bailiff hesitated, unsure whether to pick it up or salute. Danielle calmly retrieved it, set it back on the table, and stood. Up until then, her voice had been rationed like water in a desert. Now it flowed, cool and steady. "I wasn't here to defend myself," she said. "I was here to expose you." Her words had gravity. They fell through the air like stones, impossible to ignore. Reynolds's mouth opened, but no sound came. He finally croaked, "This is a trick." But even the judge was rattled, his authority shaken. "Miss Carter," he began, cautious, but Danielle cut across gently. "My presence in this courtroom is not an accident, and neither is his." She didn't point at Reynolds. She didn't have to. Every eye followed her meaning. The doors opened at the back, and men in dark suits entered, their movements crisp, deliberate. The lead agent stepped forward, credentials in hand. "Agent Thomas Blake, United States Intelligence," he said calmly. "For the limited purpose of these proceedings, Ms. Danielle Carter's credentials are authentic. She is operating in coordination with federal authorities." The word authentic spread like a warm front across cold ground. The gallery recalibrated. The narrative they had believed in shattered. Reynolds stammered, tried to protest, but two agents moved toward him, polite but firm. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut silenced the room. Reynolds, the man who had strutted all week, now stared at the chain between his hands as if it had appeared by magic. The gallery watched in stunned silence as he was led away, his swagger stripped bare. Danielle stood, calm, dignified, saying only, "Justice doesn't scream. It just arrives." The words carried like a benediction. Even Judge Whitman lowered his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of what had unfolded. The trial had turned, not with thunder, but with clarity. The courthouse doors opened, spilling Danielle into the gray light of afternoon, and the world outside roared alive. Flashbulbs cracked like lightning, camera shutters rapid and relentless. Microphones thrust forward as reporters shouted over one another, their voices blending into a storm of questions. "Miss Carter, were you undercover this whole time? Do you believe the system can change? Will you testify against Reynolds?" The questions came like bullets, each one demanding a reaction, a statement, a soundbite to feed tomorrow's headlines. Danielle moved through them with a steady pace, shoulders squared, her face unreadable. She did not hurry, did not cower, did not grant them a single word. To anyone watching, it was as though the storm itself bent around her, the noise washing off without ever touching her center. There was no smile of triumph, no expression of anger. She walked as if carrying nothing at all, even though everyone knew she had just overturned an entire courtroom. Then a figure broke through the crowd, Angela Moore, her eyes wet with tears, her arms outstretched. She pushed past reporters and cameras, reaching Danielle with the urgency of someone who had carried fear for too long. She caught Danielle in an embrace so fierce it nearly lifted her off her feet. Her voice broke, but the words carried, strong enough for those nearby to hear. "You didn't just fight for yourself," Angela sobbed. "You fought for all of us." For the first time that day, Danielle's expression shifted, not into a smile and not into tears, but into something softer, gentler, an acknowledgement that passed beyond words. She placed her hand on Angela's back, holding her for a long breath, before pulling away just enough to meet her eyes. She gave a single slow nod, and in that nod was everything. A yes, a promise, an unspoken truth that the fight had never been hers alone. The cameras caught it all. The embrace, the tears, the nod. Reporters sensed the moment slipping and shouted louder, their voices rising like waves trying to crash against rock. "What does this mean for the case? Will you speak to the public? Do you have anything to say to the people watching?" Danielle gave them nothing. No declarations, no speeches. She let silence answer in her place, and in that silence she was louder than any headline. Her eyes lifted beyond the cameras, beyond the pressing crowd, to something far in the distance. Whether it was the horizon, a memory, or truth itself, no one could say. But whatever it was, it made her look untethered from the chaos around her, as though she already belonged to a place beyond reach. The press pushed harder, the crowd swelling, but Danielle continued walking. Angela remained by her side, the agents flanking them with quiet precision, their movements steady and protective. Step by step, the noise fell away, replaced by the rhythm of her resolve. By the time she reached the waiting car at the curb, the shouting had dulled into background static. She entered the car without haste, the door closing behind her with a soft, final click. And just like that, her silence became the story. I stood there with the others, caught in the aftershock, realizing that what lingered wasn't the badge, or the gavel, or even Reynolds's downfall. What stayed was the quiet dignity of a woman who understood that justice does not need applause to be real. The people on those courthouse steps remained buzzing long after she was gone. Some were angry, demanding more explanation, unwilling to surrender their prejudice even when confronted with truth. Others were awed, whispering to each other about what they had witnessed, but most simply fell quiet, their certainty unsettled, left with reflection instead of resolution. And isn't that what truth often does? It doesn't always arrive in fireworks. Sometimes it comes like a tide, slow and steady, pulling away what doesn't belong until only what's real remains. As I left the courthouse myself, I carried that silence with me. It sat heavier than any speech could have, because it asked a question without asking. If she could stand in the fire and not bow, what excuse do the rest of us have? That was the echo Danielle Carter left behind, a reminder that justice may stumble, may crawl, may be delayed, but it will not be denied. Danielle had shown that even in the darkest rooms, a single voice, or even a single moment of unshaken silence, can turn the tide. She had endured the weight of rumor, the sting of betrayal, the roar of prejudice, and yet she had not broken. Instead, she had waited for the moment when truth could stand on its own. And when it did, she did not seize it with fury. She did not wield it like a weapon. She simply stood, letting the truth reveal itself, letting arrogance collapse under its own weight. The headlines the next day painted the story in bold strokes. Officer exposed in court. CIA operative unveils truth. Corruption case shattered. But those who had been in the room, those who had felt the shift, knew that none of those words captured what truly happened. The real story was not the badge or the agents or even the handcuffs around Reynolds's wrists. The real story was the quiet, steady presence of a woman who refused to let noise dictate the ending. Inside that courtroom, people had watched certainty crumble. They had seen the smugness of a corrupt officer unravel into desperation. They had witnessed a judge forced to swallow his pride and admit the ground had shifted beneath him. They had seen an ordinary woman, Angela Moore, step into her fear and speak truth with trembling hands, reminding everyone that courage isn't the absence of fear. It is moving forward despite it. And they had seen Danielle, who bore the weight of it all, remain unflinching, choosing silence until silence itself became her weapon. That was what justice looked like that day. Not a gavel slammed in triumph, not a speech that roused applause, but the slow realization that truth had walked into the room and refused to leave. Justice was in the recalibration of a court that had lost its way. It was in the bow of a judge's head, small yet monumental, signaling humility after arrogance. It was in the quiet collapse of a man who thought his badge gave him the right to lie. And it was in the refusal of a woman to let chaos dictate her story. By the time the dust settled, people understood something had changed. Maybe not the system in its entirety, maybe not the world overnight, but something inside them. They had felt the ground move. They had heard the hinges of truth, faint but undeniable. For once, a courtroom that had been thick with bias and presumption had held light instead of shadow, if only for a moment. And for those who witnessed it, that moment could not be forgotten. Danielle Carter walked away without fanfare, without a statement, without the satisfaction of proving everyone wrong. She walked away with nothing but her silence and her dignity intact. And somehow that was enough. Because justice does not demand applause and truth does not need to shout. They arrive quietly, like a tide or a breath, steady and undeniable. As I left the courthouse steps that day, I found myself thinking not about Reynolds, not about the evidence, not even about the badge. I thought about the stillness of Danielle's hands, the restraint in her voice, the composure that never faltered. I thought about Angela's trembling courage, about the tears that turned into steel in her words. I thought about the judge lowering his head, the crowd's certainty unraveling, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut, and I realized that the power of the story was not in its drama but in its restraint. Justice, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived with silence, with a nod, with dignity that could not be stolen. And that was the lesson Danielle Carter left us with, that sometimes the strongest answer isn't defiance but composure, not rage but restraint, not noise but quiet strength. That was how she turned a courtroom upside down. That was how she showed the world that truth, no matter how delayed, cannot be denied. And in that revelation, every person there was left with a question they could not escape. If she could stand, then why couldn't we?